Hello, and thank you for clicking on my video. My name is Alex, and I'm an actor and a writer, and I live here in beautiful Tasmania. Now, for anyone watching that doesn't know, Tasmania is an island off the coast of Australia, and we're so far south that if you went any further south, sooner or later you'd bump into Antarctica. Tasmania is also very old. In fact, some of our rocks date back to the Triassic period, which is almost 251 million years ago. That means we have some very old fossils here. And huge areas of Tasmania are relatively unexplored wilderness, a sort of lost world. Now that brings me to the story you're about to listen to. This story is one that I wrote, and it's the first in a series of 20 set in a place called Dinosaur Dell. Dinosaur Dell is a village that is entirely inhabited by dinosaurs and other prehistoric reptiles. Now, this first story is the story of Jake the Egg, and it introduces some of my characters, including the hero, Jake. Now, I'll let you into a little secret. Some of my dinosaur characters are based on people I know, and Jake is based on my godson when he was very, 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 very much smaller. I hope you enjoy listening to this story, and stick around at the end for some information about the real dinosaurs behind the characters in my story.
Under the volcano. And not too far from the sulphur springs and the pits of tar. In the middle of a forest of tall tree-ferns, you'll find some houses where the footpath turns. This is where I live. You can tell from the roars my neighbours are all dinosaurs. I'm Alex the Alxosaurus. Hello. Now, once upon 70 million years ago... Wait. Which of the stories shall I tell about the dinosaurs living in Dinosaur Dell? The story of Jake the Egg. In a nest of leaves, by the shore of the lake, there was an egg whose name was Jake. Knock, knock, knock. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Jake the Egg began to hatch. Gosh, said Jake, who had been an egg, but definitely wasn't anymore. He said it mostly to himself, as there was no one else around. I'm definitely not an egg. I wonder what I am. A huge dragonfly whizzed over the surface of the lake, making ripples. Maybe if I could see myself, said Jake, to himself again, as the dragonfly had disappeared into the wood beyond the lake on her shimmering wings. He scrambled down to the edge of the lake and peered into the water. It was like a mirror. A face peered back. The face was on top of a long, blue neck. Well, that's funny, said Jake. My neck doesn't feel that long. Suddenly, the face popped out of the water entirely. Hello, said Jake. Who are you? I'm Cousteau, said the creature happily. And I'm a plesiosaurus. And who are you? I'm Jake, said Jake. And perhaps I'm a plesiosaurus too. I don't think so, said Cousteau doubtfully. You're far too tiny. Besides, a plesiosaurus has this long neck and flippers, which makes her streamlined. Oh, said Jake, who wasn't really sure what that meant.
Your neck is far too short, and those little feet wouldn't be much good for swimming. No, you're far too tiny to be a plesiosaurus, I'm afraid.
Perhaps I could try, said Jake. But the plesiosaurus had vanished into the lake with a splash. Jake stuck his head under the water.
Cousteau?
He called, though it came out as bubbles. The plesiosaurus was nowhere to be seen through the colourful shoals of fish that surrounded him. Suddenly, a huge fish with teeth like razors appeared out of the gloomy depths of the lake with a wicked glint in his eye. Just in time, Jake pulled his head out of the water. The jaws of the fish snapped shut on nothing. Cheated of a tasty snack, it lashed its tail crossly. Jake scrambled up the sandy shore, shaking the water off of himself.
Phew,
he said.
Perhaps it's better not to be a plesiosaurus. If my neck were any longer, that fish would have caught me.
And he wandered along, pondering.
I wonder what I am.
The thought was so preoccupying, he had to sit down on a mangrove root to think about it. Suddenly, some of the roots nearby began to move around most alarmingly. They weren't roots at all, but bumps on someone's tail.
Hello,
said Jake.
Who are you?
I'm Stig, said the creature, giggling. And I'm a stegosaurus. And who are you?
I'm Jake,
said Jake.
And perhaps I'm a stegosaurus too.
I don't think so, said Stig doubtfully. You're far too tiny. And anyway, a stegosaurus has these bony plates and these spikes on his tail. It's called a thagomizer.
Oh,
said Jake, who had never heard the word, which was hardly surprising, as Stig had just made it up. Your tiny little tail wouldn't be much good for keeping you out of danger. No, you're far too tiny to be a stegosaurus.
Perhaps I could try,
said Jake. But the stegosaurus had squelched away into the mangroves, swishing his thagomizer from side to side.
Well, said Jake, I guess he went that way. Stig?
He called. But the only answer he got was from a mangrove crab who clacked his claws at him. Jake walked further and further into the swamp, and the further he went, the deeper he sank into the swamp.
Oops,
said Jake, who was now up to his middle in a puddle of mud. He started to wiggle and squirm, but that only made him sink deeper. Suddenly, his little tail, which was still poking out of the mud, touched a mangrove root. Without thinking, he curled it around the root and used it to hook himself out of the swamp. He scrambled up a mossy bank, wiping off the smelly mud.
Phew,
he said.
Perhaps it's better not to be a stegosaurus. I'd never have gotten out of that swamp with spikes on my tail.
And he wandered along, pondering.
I wonder what I am.
He got so tired out thinking about it that he stopped for a rest in the middle of a forest of towering sequoia trees. He leaned against a mighty trunk to catch his breath, when suddenly the trunk started to move. It wasn't a tree trunk. It was someone's leg. Far above him, a head on a long neck peered down at him.
Hello,
said Jake.
Who are you?
I'm Bob,
said the creature, smilingly.
And I'm a brachiosaurus. And who are you?
I'm Jake,
said Jake.
And perhaps I'm a brachiosaurus too?
I shouldn't think so,
said Bob, doubtfully.
You're far too tiny. A brachiosaurus is quite the tallest dinosaur around, 59 feet, and you're hardly even 1 foot.
Oh,
said Jake, who felt very small indeed now.
You're far too tiny to be a brachiosaurus, little one,
said Bob with a smile.
Perhaps I could try,
said Jake. But the brachiosaurus had lumbered into the forest, shaking leaves from the trees as he passed.
Bob?
called Jake after him, but the brachiosaurus's head was so far up in the treetops he would never have heard. Jake picked his way through the fern fronds on the forest floor. Suddenly, he heard a rustling. Perhaps Bob was coming back. But it wasn't Bob. It was a pack of marauding crocodiliforms. There were 5 of them, snapping at the lacewing flies they stirred up from the undergrowth. "Gosh," said Jake, and without a sound clambered up into a tall sequoia right up to the topmost branch. Far beneath him, the hungry crocodiliforms sniffed the air and moved on through the forest, still hungry. "Phew," said Jake, clambering down. "Perhaps it's better not to be a brachiosaurus. I'd never have managed to climb that tree." And he wandered along, pondering. "I wonder what I am." Because he wasn't looking where he was going, he tripped straight over a rock, right in the middle of the path. The rock was not very happy, and harumphed loudly from its other end. It wasn't a rock at all. "Hello," said Jake. "Who are you?"
I am the brigadier, said the creature pompously, and I am a Euopolocephalus. And who, might I ask, are you, young dinosaur?
"I'm Jake," said Jake. "And perhaps I'm a Euoplocephalus too?"
Nonsense, said the brigadier bluntly. You're far too tiny. In any case, a Euoplocephalus has a club on his tail and is fully armoured, even his eyelids.
"Oh,"
said Jake, blinking his own eyelids, which were definitely not armoured with bone.
You're far too tiny to be a Euoplocephalus.
"Perhaps I could try?"
said Jake. But the Euoplocephalus had gone wheezing away over the rocks. Jake didn't think calling after the brigadier was a very good idea, so on he went, through the rocky canyons. Thin red towers of rocks called hoodoos rose up on all sides of him. He could just squeeze through them and was quite relieved to get to the other side at last. As he looked back, he could see that large boulders balanced precariously on top of the towers.
"Phew,"
said Jake, looking at his skinny tail.
"Perhaps it's better not to be a Euoplocephalus. With all that armour, I could never have squeezed through there. I'd have ended up with a rock on my head."
And he wandered along, pondering.
"I wonder what I am."
He followed a tinkling brook that fell down the cliffs beyond in sparkling ribbons. When he got to the cliffs, there was no way but up. So he began to climb. Halfway up, he reached up his little hand and grabbed a large stalactite that was hanging out of a cave. Said the stalactite, and Jake only just managed to stop himself falling down the cliff. He looked up and saw a pair of beady eyes at the end of the long, sharp beak he had just grabbed.
"Hello,"
said Jake.
"Who are you?"
"I am the professor,
said the creature sagely.
and I am a pteranodon. And who are you?"
"I'm Jake,"
said Jake.
"and perhaps I'm a pteranodon too."
"Oh, not likely,"
said the professor.
"You're far too tiny. In any case, a pteranodon has wings 12 feet wide."
"Oh,"
said Jake, looking at his little arms, which definitely weren't wings.
"Perhaps I could try?"
"Oh, I don't think so,"
said Professor Pteranodon, and stretched out her wings proudly. At that moment, a huge gust of wind swept the face of the rocks, and with a surprised screech, Professor Pteranodon, caught unawares, was bowled over the cliff, flapping her leathery wings, and crash-landed in a heap in some ginkgo trees far below.
"Phew,"
said Jake, looking at his fingers, holding tight to the rocks.
"Perhaps it's better not to be a pteranodon. Fingers might be better than wings sometimes."
And he pulled himself up to the top of the cliffs. And he wandered along, pondering.
"I wonder what Oh!"
And he forgot to wonder, because on a bank of moss were some beautiful larch cones, green and pink. He bent down to pick one up, and there was a shrill squeal as from behind the bank appeared a face with 3 horns and a large grey frill, decorated with the pink and green larch cones.
"Hello,"
said Jake.
Who are you?
I am Tracy,
said the creature indignantly.
and I am a triceratops. And who are you?
But I'm Jake,
said Jake.
and perhaps I'm a triceratops too.
Definitely not,
said Tracy.
You're far too tiny. In any case, a triceratops has a horn on her snout and a pair above her eyes, as well as this pretty frill.
Oh,
said Jake.
You're far too tiny to be a triceratops. Now, out of my way, there's a good boy. I was just having a lie down, but I've got so many errands to run this afternoon. Claw Marks and Spencer's is closing soon.
And before Jake could say anything, the triceratops had bustled away. On went Jake, feeling quite downcast now. He still wasn't sure what he was, though he definitely wasn't an egg.
or a plesiosaurus, or a stegosaurus, or a brachiosaurus, or a euoplocephalus, or a pteranodon. Oh!
And he bumped into someone, face first.
Perhaps it's better not to be a triceratops too. If I had a horn on my nose, I would have hurt you.
A huge face, with a mouth full of sharp teeth, grinned down at him.
Hello,
Said Jake.
who are you?
I'm Tyrone,
Said the creature, still grinning.
and I am a Tyrannosaurus. And who are you?
Well, I'm Jake,
Said Jake.
and perhaps I'm a Tyrannosaurus too.
I doubt that,
Said Tyrone.
You're far too tiny. In any case, you only squeak, but a Tyrannosaurus can.
And Jake ran off, as fast as his legs would carry him.
Oh, drat,
Said Tyrone to himself.
perhaps it's better not to be a Tyrannosaurus sometimes. I always forget how loud I am.
Jake couldn't run any more. He plonked himself down on a rock, which was definitely a rock this time, and not the tail of a grumpy euoplocephalus, and sighed to himself loudly.
Well, I don't know what I am. I'm not like any of them. I'm neither one thing nor the other. And if I'm not something or another thing, then I must be a nothing. Oh, I don't want to be a nothing.
And poor Jake sniffed, and a tear rolled down his cheek.
Cheer up, Jake,
Said a voice. It was Cousteau, the plesiosaurus.
You might be tiny, but you dodged that fearsome fish.
And rescued yourself from that smelly swamp, added Stig, the stegosaurus, lumbering up to join them.
And escape those carnivorous crocodiliforms,
Put in Bob, the brachiosaurus.
avoided the precarious boulders. Good work that, my lad.
Said Brigadier Euoplocephalus.
You climbed the cliff.
Cried Professor Pteranodon as she alighted, still a trifle rumpled from her crash landing.
And even took on a Tyrannosaurus.
Smiled Tracy Triceratops as she appeared, claw in claw with Tyrone the Tyrannosaurus. And no one couldn't do that, cried Stig.
Grammar!
Winced Professor Pteranodon. Ooh, where? I hope she's bought sweeties. Professor Pteranodon shook her head in despair.
But I still don't know what I am,
Said Jake. And that's where I came in. Perhaps I can help, as it's my job to tell the stories of everyone in Dinosaur Dell. I know who you are, and they joined me in chorus. You're a dinosaur called a Weewarosaurus. And though you are tiny, you're not at all weak. Your adventurous spirit is truly unique. So don't look downhearted, and please don't be sad, because you are special.
It's my mum and my dad.
Our little adventurer, so brave and bold, Jake Weewarosaurus. And that's Jake's tale told. Here's a little bit more about my story. There are several different types of dinosaur in my story. Some of them come from the Jurassic period, which started 201 million years ago, and some of them come from the Cretaceous period, which started 145 million years ago and ended 66 million years ago. Of course, most important is Weewarrasaurus. Weewarrasaurus was a Cretaceous dinosaur that lived near Lightning Ridge in New South Wales, Australia. His fossil was found preserved in a beautiful blue-green opal. Did you know that about 23 different dinosaurs have been found in what is now Australia? One of the only places that doesn't have any dinosaur fossils is Tasmania, because Tasmania's rocks are too old. One of the fossils found there is of Tasmaniosaurus, a type of reptile from the Triassic period. That's 251 million years ago, so even older than most dinosaurs. He might have looked like a large monitor lizard. Alxosaurus was a Cretaceous dinosaur, whose name means lizard from the Alxa Desert, which was the place in Mongolia where his fossil was found in 1994. He had long claws on each hand. Stegosaurus was a Jurassic dinosaur, whose name means roof lizard. He had a spiked tail to defend himself, and plates on his back that might have helped him control his temperature. Brachiosaurus was a Jurassic dinosaur whose name means arm lizard because of his long front legs. He might have weighed about 56 metric tons, which means he was very heavy. Euoplocephalus was a Cretaceous dinosaur whose name means well-armed head. He was covered in armour, including bumpy nodules called scutes, and 2 bony rings protected his neck. Triceratops was a Cretaceous dinosaur, whose name means 3-horned face. She might have been able to change the colour of her frill by controlling the blood supply to it. Tyrannosaurus was a Cretaceous dinosaur, a huge carnivore whose name means tyrant lizard. He was almost 12 metres, that's 40 feet long, and he had the most forceful bite of any land animal ever. Plesiosaurus wasn't a dinosaur, but a marine reptile that lived in the Jurassic period. Her name means near lizard. The first fossil was discovered by Mary Anning in Dorset, England, in 1823. Pteranodon wasn't a dinosaur either, but a flying reptile that lived in the Cretaceous period. Her name means toothless wing, and scientists think that she flew like a modern-day albatross does. Caprosuchus was a Cretaceous crocodiliform, which is not easy to say. That's a crocodile-like reptile. Its name means boar crocodile because it had 2 large tusks, like a boar. Libellulium was a large dragonfly, like those today, but one that lived during the Cretaceous period. Xiphactinus was a fierce, predatory Cretaceous fish. One fossil was 4 metres, that's 13 feet long, and its stomach contained a fish almost 2 metres, or 6 feet long, which it had swallowed whole. And did you know there were no plants on Earth that had flowers until the late Cretaceous period? Conifers, such as larch and sequoia, were common. One type of sequoia tree, the dawn redwood in Northern California, was measured as 7 metres, that's 23 feet across, and 28 metres or 94 feet tall. Only one species of ginkgo survives today, the maidenhair tree. All the others are extinct. One ginkgo tree in Japan lived from 1063 to 2010. Now that is a very old tree indeed.
Well, thank you for joining me for a story from Dinosaur Dell. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed writing it and telling it. Now, one day, I'd obviously like to turn all of my Dinosaur Dell stories into storybooks that anyone can read at home, perhaps using some of the character drawings and photos of Tasmania that you saw on the screen while I was reading the story. I'd love to hear from you, so if you enjoyed the story, or you'd just like to say hello, or even better, tell me who your favourite dinosaur is, please let me know in the comments below. Or do visit my website, www.alexscottfairley.com. And hopefully I'll see you next time for another story from Dinosaur Dell. Bye for now.